Economic questions interest people all the time. Whether it is economic growth or inflation or public debt, the questions of the economy in which we live and contribute always linger consciously or subconsciously in their minds while making their choices. However, when they think about the economy as a whole, people somehow think it is just an aggregate outcome of individual decisions. For example, when they talk about public debt or total savings in the economy, they extrapolate from their individual experiences. This habitual way of thinking lands into all sorts of contradictions, such as increase in personal savings lead to increase in aggregate savings, or increase in individual debt may lead to higher public debt. These contradictions arise from the fallacy of reasoning that generalizes the individual experiences to the economy as a whole. This is one of the fundamental stumbling blocks in how we understand macroeconomics. This podcast series aims to distill and detangle how we think about macroeconomics while at the same time integrating real life aspects like gender, power in this subject. My name is Raghav Srinivas and I'm joined by Chavi, Mehta and Wajeeha Hamdani in this conversation.
In this episode, we dive right into the fallacy of inference, which comes from the understanding that the aggregate spending is nothing but the sum of individual expenditures in the economy. Extending this logic, can we say that aggregating microeconomic behavior will lead to macroeconomic outcomes?
Well, the short answer is no, Chavi, because this is a common mistake people make when they talk about the economy as a whole or the macroeconomy, extrapolating from individual choices to the aggregate. Let's try to unpack this issue. Think of the following scenario. Suppose that the economy is divided between households and firms. If all households in the economy increase their consumption expenditures, the aggregate consumption expenditure will surely rise. Fine. If all firms in the economy increase their investment expenditure, aggregate investment expenditure will also rise. Fine. But when everyone, both households and firms, increase their savings, the aggregate savings might actually fall. You see?
But how does this exactly happen?
So, Wajeeha, this is the fallacy of composition comes into play here. When households increase their savings, demand for goods and services fall because they're not consuming. So, demand for goods and services fall. This means this will in turn reduce the firm's profits and ends their firm's own savings, right? So, adding up individual choices can lead to counterintuitive outcomes. Increasing individual savings may actually reduce the size of the total savings or the size of the total market, right? Now, this is what John Maynard Keynes called as paradox of thrift. Everyone going thrifty may actually lead to lower aggregate savings. This is the so-called fallacy of composition in logic, where we wrongly infer that what is true for some parts of the whole is also true for the whole. That is, what applies at the microeconomic level will also apply at the macroeconomic level. This is not true. The fallacy of composition is at the core of understanding macroeconomics. And this is where we always stumble in our classrooms, that people immediately go from micro to macro as if macro can be aggregated from micro. So fallacy of composition comes as a stumbling block. So this helps us from not making the habitual mistake of thinking of that the macroeconomy is simply an adding up of individual decisions or choices. So once we clarify this difference between micro, which is individual level, and macro, economy wide, then we begin to understand how flawed the micro-founded approach to macroeconomics is. Right? In fact, it is the other way around. Actually, we need macro economy in all our microeconomic decisions, which is what the heterodox school of macroeconomics would talk about. And it is the macroeconomy that actually influences microeconomic decisions. It's actually the other way around, right?
That makes sense. Can you think of a good example to explain this better?
Let's think about simple example. Like let's take a pizza maker, right? Individual, some small pizza maker. The firm can only control its costs. What determines its profits? Profits are total revenues minus total costs, right? Pizza maker can only control his cost, right? And to some extent price of the pizza that he sells. the firm's revenues are driven by the demand for pizzas, right? Which depends on the macroeconomy or the size of the market, which you cannot control, right? So as you can see, it is the macroeconomic conditions that determines individual level profits, because the pizza maker cannot control how much revenue is earning. That depends on how many people are buying his pizzas. So this is the difference. This is how macroeconomy comes into individual microeconomic decisions, right? That's one example that I can give of Wajeeha.
Hmm. Okay, then there are 2 points that stand out from our discussion. First is that the conventional way of thinking about the macroeconomy as simply an aggregation of microeconomic decisions leads to counterintuitive conclusions. And second, such a micro foundational approach to macroeconomics misleads about unemployment being simply a labor market issue or individual incentive or skill issue. Better incentives or more skills will guarantee employment. So then jobs are not a problem but actually a lack of skill.
Micro foundational idea that it's not jobs which are the problem, but it's actually the lack of skill. So if you upskill your workers, then there would be full employment.
Yeah.
So that is the kind of fallacy here.
Yeah, that's a fallacy here.
Yeah.
How you start saying that upskill your labor force, you will somehow, jobs will be guaranteed. But jobs are demand driven. They're not supply driven. Now that's you can think of many of the policy that we have in Indian economy today in terms of production linked incentive schemes, ease of doing business. These are all, trying to say, okay, we give you an environment to do business, but that does not determine how much investments that are happening in the economy. Investment is purely driven by the size of the market, how much demand there is for their products, goods and services, right? This is the macroeconomy coming into influence microeconomic decisions.
That makes sense. I was reading in the news about the government, production linked incentives for the semiconductor industry, and how the government of India had laid out this $10 billion worth of, PLIs, but there were no takers for it, which is a very clear indication that there was a demand story there, that there were no, firms taking that up, even if the government opened that up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that makes sense now.
Yeah, no, this is very true, because I think this is the disconnect that we have in terms of this mythical economy that is assumed in this rational agent microeconomic based models that informs policy, and the reality of Indian economy that there is unequal growth and inequality in the economy. This is the disconnect that we have between policy thinking and the reality of the economy, which is clearly the link between macro and micro. In terms of going forward, in terms of policy, why are these policies are not very successful, as you talked about, the production linked incentives, no takers and so on. I think the demand should be at the central of policy making. How do you create demand in the economy? That should be central focus of the policy making in Indian economy. And the reason why it's not there is because the policy models are driven by this kind of link between micro founded macro models. There's no feedback that is coming from macro to micro. So we're going to dwell much deeper into these questions on many different problems that we actually have in policies in the next episode. So it's great talking to you, Wajeeha and Chavi.
That's a great segue to the next episode, which is about the supply side story that we've been hearing about in economics, which is supply creates its own demand. So I think...
Excellent. Let's
Yeah.
pick it up in the
Yeah.
next episode. Great.